Presentation 9. This program is based on the Registered Behavior Technician task list and is designed to meet the 40-hour training requirement for RBT certification. This program is offered independent of the BACB. Implement discontinuous measurement procedures. Partial interval sampling and whole interval sampling. Alright guys, this won't make much sense until we're actually doing it, but let's go over it a little bit. Partial interval sampling. This is a way of taking data on behaviors using intervals. So, what's an interval? It's basically any little time frame that we come up with. A section of time that is broken up into little or smaller sections. It can be anywhere from 10 seconds to days. So for example, if I have a 24-hour day and I break it up into 24 periods, 1-hour periods, those would be 1-hour intervals. So a week is broken up into 24-hour intervals. An ABA therapy session is broken up into 30-minute intervals. Those are two examples that we could use, right? So in partial interval sampling, for whatever the interval is, if the behavior being measured occurs at all, the interval is marked to indicate that the behavior occurred. So, for example, if we are using 30-minute intervals and we're tracking, let's say, head hitting, and the person goes 29 minutes, remember this is a 30-minute interval, and hits their head one time, we have to mark that interval as occurring. So, when we do partial interval sampling, as an RBT, your job will be to mark those intervals. As a behavior analyst, I typically will use partial interval sampling when I want to get a more liberal view of the behavior. And I'm not talking about politics, I'm talking about if we're doing partial interval sampling, we're probably going to get an overestimation of how much the behavior is actually occurring. Because remember, if we're doing a 30-minute interval and that person only hits their head one time, we still mark it as it occurred during that interval. And as a behavior analyst, what I do is I look at the percentage of intervals that the person did it in. So let's say we were doing a 3-hour session that day. So a 3-hour session broken down into 30-minute intervals, there would be 6 of those 30-minute intervals. And let's say that person hit their head in 3 of them. 3 of the intervals. But they only hit their head 3 times, but it was in 3 different intervals. So that would mean that 50% of those intervals, he hit their head. That would give me an overestimation of how much that behavior might actually be occurring. It's a good thing though, because when I do an intervention and I can actually see a decrease, I can be pretty confident that there probably really is a decrease going on. But again, that's getting a little too detailed for this type of training. We'll talk about that more in depth in a little bit. In whole interval sampling, this means that the behavior had to occur for the entire interval to be marked as an occurrence. So in my example earlier, the 30 minutes example, that person would have to hit their head for the whole 30 minutes for us to count. This gives us a much more conservative record of whether the behavior occurred. I will typically use whole interval sampling when a behavior occurs at a very high rate, and I usually make it so that intervals are a little shorter. Because there's no way someone is going to engage. Well, there might be, right? But for the most part, we're going to probably use shorter intervals than 30 minutes if we're going to use whole interval sampling. Or if a behavior can occur for a long period of time. In-seat behavior would be one example where a whole interval might be relevant for those long time periods. But again, that's getting too detailed right now. Just know, for whole interval sampling, that means that the person had to engage in the behavior for the whole interval for it to be marked as an occurrence. Yet another way to take data on behavior using intervals is known as momentary time sampling. Basically, we set a time frame, let's say 10 minutes here, and we'll give the individual like a timer, a little buzzer that might go off. At the point at which the interval terminates or ends, when that little buzzer goes off, if the behavior is occurring, the interval is marked as an occurrence. If it is not occurring, we move on to the next interval. Basically, this is a good process for someone like a teacher who's very busy with maybe 20 other students who can't continually watch someone. So they're looking to see if, when the timer goes off, if the behavior is occurring. If it is marked as occurring in that interval. Momentary time sampling. So think of it like this. Okay, we're watching a patient, we're observing a patient. Okay, we're observing several others. You have a little timer, and that timer goes off. You look up. If the behavior is occurring, you mark it as occurred. Even if it didn't occur any other time, if it's occurring when you looked at them and when that interval was up, you marked it as occurred. Contrast that with continuous measurement procedures. Discontinuous measurement procedures means that we're going to measure samples, or not every instance of the behavior per session. There are three primary types of discontinuous measurement procedures: partial interval measures, whole interval measures, and momentary time sampling. So before we talk about the different types, I want to make sure that you know what an interval is. When I say an interval, what I mean is a length of time. In applied behavior analysis, we're going to try to make, for comparison's sake, intervals always to be the same amount of time between what we're comparing. So for example, I would not compare something that had a 30-second interval to something that had a 10-second interval. We would want to make them equal. Basically, we're striving when we're comparing to be comparing two of the same things. But for this discussion's sake, for an RBT, I want you to know that an interval is a length of time. So, let's say I break a minute into two 30-second periods. I could say each is a 30-second interval. From this, we'll be able to calculate a percentage of time the behavior occurred. So, an example result might say something like this: the patient was in seat 55% of the time. Again, from these discontinuous measures, we'll be able to calculate a percentage of time that the behavior occurred, and we can compare across time. Partial and whole interval recording and momentary time sampling gives us an estimation of the number of behaviors that are occurring or that the individual engages in. These are nice because we don't have to record every single instance of a behavior, but we do have to have a little bit of setup, and we'll go over that here in a minute. So, before we start examples, let's select our interval length. Let's say that we're going to do a 10-minute observation, and then we're going to break this into 20 intervals. Remember, we're going to make those intervals the same length. The intervals will be then 30 seconds. So we will have 20 30-second intervals. Here's what an example chart might look like. Notice there are 20 intervals on there. Now a real one is probably going to have a lot more instructions on it. For example, what your interval is going to be and what behavior you're looking at. But this is just for illustration purposes. Another consideration when using these measurements is you're going to want to have something that can non-intrusively tell you when an interval is up. I myself am a little old school. I use what's called a motivator. It gives you a little buzz, and you can set for different interval lengths. To be honest with you, I'm not sure if there's any phone app that does that. Although I'm sure there is, where you can set like a stopwatch or something that buzzes every 30 seconds or every 20, whatever the interval length is. But basically you want it to be non-intrusive. If you're simply just doing an observation, such as in a classroom, you may be able to use like the watch or the clock or something on the second hand. That may not be quite as accurate as you might like. But basically you're going to want to have something that can signal you when each interval is done. Another thing I like to do is to make sure that every interval is marked, whether a behavior occurred or not. Now you'll see in the examples in a few minutes what it's going to look like. But here, this example, see that X right there? I might put that, and it helps me to keep track of what interval I'm on. So, for example, if a behavior did not occur in interval 1, I might just put the X before I move on to interval 2. So like when the buzz goes off, when I know the interval's up, I'll put an X just so I know that nothing occurred in that interval and that I'm also currently on interval 2. That's just a practice I do. You don't need to do that, but it helps to keep track of what interval you're on. So now we can talk about what these actually are. Whole interval recording. In a whole interval recording, the behavior must occur for the whole interval for the interval to be marked as having the behavior occurred. This will give us an underestimation of the behavior because it has to happen for the whole interval. So, for example, let's say we're doing in-seat behavior, which is what we're going to track here. For it to be marked, the person would have to be in seat the entire interval. So let's say the person sits in the seat for 29 seconds but gets up. Because it wasn't for the whole interval, we don't mark it as occurring. This is why it gives us an underestimation of behavior. As an analyst, personally, I use this for tracking desired behavior because I'd rather have an underestimation of that, because if we see an improvement, that means something really is going on. Although this is not a rule. I want to stress that. It's not a rule. What kind of recording you're going to use is going to depend on what the analyst tells you to use. So, for this example, we're going to do in-seat behavior. If you notice that on the top, there's an operational definition of what that means. JM has to be in his seat with feet on the ground. This is what the chart would look like filled out. Remember, I'm using those X's to keep track of where I'm at. So, in interval 1, in all the 30 seconds, for the whole interval, he was not in seat. Same for interval 2. But interval 3, you see I put that plus. And so remember, that's a strategy I use to mark intervals that are already over with the X. If you do that, make sure that the mark that you're doing for an interval where the actual behavior occurred looks different. So here I use a plus. So on this example chart, pluses equal the behavior occurred, X means it did not occur. So remember, for me to mark that plus, the behavior would have had to have occurred through the whole 30-second interval. So JM was in his seat for the whole 30 seconds in interval 3. And that's how it would look filled out. So as you can see on there, in interval 3, 5, 6, 11, 14, 15, 18, and 19, JM was in his seat for the entire 30-second interval. From here, I can calculate a percentage of intervals. So let's do that. Percentage of intervals. We're going to take the number of intervals that it occurred in. So here, there was 8 intervals that were marked as the behavior occurring. And we're going to divide by the total number of intervals, which was 20. And we're going to multiply that by 100 to get the percentage of intervals. So we're going to take that 8, we're going to divide it by 20. This gives us an answer of 0.4. Then we're going to multiply that by 100. This gives us 40. So we can say that in 40% of intervals, the patient was in seat. partial interval recording. The behavior must occur only one time during the interval for the interval to be marked. This gives us an overestimation of behavior because it only has to happen once during the interval. Sorry, my throat was a little raspy there, so I'll read that again. The behavior must occur only one time during the interval for the interval to be marked. This gives us an overestimation of the behavior because it only has to happen once during the interval. So in our example, jam only has to be in the seat, let's say, for 2 seconds out of that 30 seconds, and we can mark it as occurring. As an analyst, I sometimes will use this with problematic behavior to overestimate how much is actually happening. But again, that's not a rule. So here, I'm going to mark each instance. Don't compare this to the last graph. This is totally different. They're different chart. So, as you can see, I put the pluses and x's. Remember, the pluses are corrects, or that means the behavior occurred sometime in that interval, and the x is just me tracking what interval I'm on. So again, in partial interval recording, all the person has to do is engage in the behavior at any time during that interval, and it's marked as occurring. So let's say in interval 1, he was only in his seat for 3 seconds, but because it's partial interval, again, partial, it only has to occur one time or more during that interval, we'll mark it as happening. Again, we can calculate a percentage of intervals. Here, there were 12 pluses. That means that in 12 of the intervals, at some point during those intervals, he was engaged in in-seat behavior. So we're going to take that number 12, divide it by 20, it gets 0.6. That times it by 100, so we can say that in 60% of intervals, that patient was in their seat. Finally, we come to momentary time sampling. Here, the person only checks to see if the behavior is occurring at the time the interval is up. So in our example, they will be checking every 30 seconds. The signal or buzz will go off, and they will mark if the person was engaged in the behavior or not. Use the same data sheet. It is also a discontinuous measurement because you're not measuring each instance of the behavior. It underestimates behavior, but momentary time sampling is good in instances when the observer is engaged elsewhere or very busy. Typically, when I'm having teachers record data, this is the most popular one because they don't have time because they have a ton of other students to keep track of. So basically what I'm telling them is that, hey, like every time, like let's say a minute or 45 seconds, look up and see if the person is engaged in the behavior. They mark if they were or they don't or not. Here we're doing 30 seconds, remember. So I would tell the person at the 30-second point, look up. If the person is engaged in the behavior, mark the interval as it having occurred. If not, just keep track of what interval you're on. I put the X's, so there it is right there. It would look the same. The data sheet would look the same. So in interval 1, the person looked up at the 30-second point. Jam was not in their seat, so they put an X. Interval 2 occurred. So at the 30-second point of interval 2, so now we're a whole minute into it, looked up, Jam was not in their seat, so they mark X. At the minute and 30 point, so the next 30-second interval is up, they look up, and Jam was in his seat, so they would put a plus. Likewise in 4, 5, and 6, the teacher looked up, or the observer looked up, and each one of those, when the interval was over, Jam was in his seat. So as you can see, the person only has a 10 once that signal goes off to see if the person is engaged in the behavior. We can do the same thing and calculate a percentage of intervals. Here, there was 11 times he was in his seat when the teacher or observer looked up. We take that 11, divide by 20, which gets us 0.55, multiply that by 100, gets us 55. So we can say through MTS, or momentary time sampling, he was in his seat 55% of the observation. Discontinuous measurement procedures. We measure the samples of the behavior. We're not measuring every instance. Remember, like in whole interval, we're not measuring every instance of the behavior. We're just seeing if the behavior occurred at all during for the whole interval. So if it's this 30-second interval and the behavior occurred for 10 seconds and they stopped, so let's say JM got out of his seat, we no longer have to record whether he sits back down in his seat again in 5 seconds because we know that whole interval doesn't count. And in partial interval, once he sits down one time in that interval, that's the only one we have to look at. So let's say he sits down one time, stays in his seat for 5 seconds, gets up for like 10 seconds, sits back down. We're not keeping track of each instance of the behavior. We already marked that interval as occurring because it was partial interval. He already did it. In a momentary time sampling, we're only seeing at the 30-second point or whatever the point is. So in that way, we're not measuring every single instance of behavior. Again, we're estimating, or this is an estimation. We use discontinuous measurement in ABA to give us an estimation, a percentage, or it allows us to do a percentage of intervals that the behavior is occurring in. We can compare these percentages over time. We can say that at the beginning of the year, JM was in his seat 55% of intervals. By October, he was in his seat 70% of intervals. But remember, when we're comparing across time, we're going to want to be using the same intervals. So I would use in October the same amount of same 30-second interval as I did at the beginning of the year. And I would use the same type of measurement. So if I use partial interval at the beginning of the year, I'm going to use partial interval in October. So essentially, we're comparing across time. Now, as an RBT, you will not be conducting assessments. However, you may be asked by the behavior analyst to help collect data or to help collect some information for ongoing assessments. Some of the assessments that we use around here at Learning Arts include the Vinland, the VB-MAP, and the FAST. There are a lot of others, though. I don't want to go through an exhaustive list. The point is, though, is as an RBT, you may be asked to assist with some of these as ongoing assessments. It helps us to develop the individualized curriculum for the student or for the patient. So, assisting with assessments. You may be asked to take detailed ABC data, take frequency or duration data on a behavior. You're going to be asked to use observable and measurable terms to describe the behavior to some assessor, probably the analyst. You may be asked to probe some skills to see if we can set up a situation that will test the child's skill level. We may interact with the child while the observer or while the assessor or the analyst observes. We may gather anecdotal data from significant others. We may have you ask questions to the parents if we're not around, if the analyst isn't there. Okay. And we may have you administer some assessments as instructed by the assessor. But that's probably not going to happen, as the analyst would have to be there helping you with it as you are being directly supervised by them. The point is, though, is that they may have you take some detailed data and share that for the assessment. So what's a stakeholder? This is part of that, because a stakeholder is anyone who holds interest in that patient's progress. This may include parents, caregivers, person's family, person's teacher, any other professionals that are providing services to that person, or people that are just in that person's everyday life, such as a bus driver, or maybe a friend down the street. I don't know. There's a lot of people who could be stakeholders in that person's life. and you will occasionally run into them and have to communicate with them.